Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of the Rural Sense Show. I am your host, the Instructive Scholar, Mr. Grant Dahl. We got a very interesting episode for you guys here today. We're going to be having a debate on higher education in America. And we're going to be debating certain viewpoints on higher education in America. And joining me to debate on higher education is two very learned and very intellectually gifted men. And if you've listened to some of our previous episodes, you will know that they've been on this show before. One hails from the Valley of the Shadow of Death, Washington, D.C., and he works in a couple different professions, but he's mainly a very good writer, in my opinion. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the show, Mr. Paul Wilson. Paul, how are you doing, my friend?
Very well. How are you, Grant?
I am doing very well. Thank you for asking. So, and then we, from the other side of the continental United States, we welcome another genius learned man. He's more in the realm of business, however. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Matthew Mazzocco. Matthew, how are you doing?
I'm well, Grant. Thank you for mentioning the genius part. The $10 will be deposited to your account now. Thank you for that.
I did not know we were dealing in cryptocurrency on this show just yet.
Next episode.
We'll get there.
Yes, indeed. Well, with the way the Federal Reserve is ruining our money, I'm guessing we will get there at some point. Anyhow, so, well, let's dive into this topic here, because we all got somewhat different views on higher education in America, and in this particular case, when we refer to higher education, we're talking more about college and graduate school, maybe throw in a little bit of high school, since there are parts of high school which the state has not mandated as absolutely necessary any longer. I think it's the age of 16 is usually when state or federal government really doesn't care if you're going to school anymore or not. But in higher education has become so expensive today, and we really have to debate what the role is of higher education, because there was an article that came out a few weeks ago by the renowned educator and columnist Walter Williams, where he talks about educational fraud. And he shows how America's standards in the education field have really fallen over the last several years, certainly since he was in school. And you read some of the other stuff that's going on in the education field today. We've got school shootings going on. We've got ridiculous protests going on at many of our nation's institutions of higher learning. And you really wonder a lot of the time, where is this all going? Are the incoming generations of Americans really equipped to handle what the world's going to throw at them here within the next 30 years? And and obviously the key factor in preparing these young people to take up the mantle and lead is higher education, basically in the colleges and high schools. So I mean, in my own analysis, and this is basically the position I hold, is my analysis tells me that our standards have become so dumbed down, and it's become so difficult for basically talented teachers who have the ability to really get the subject matter across to their students. It's so hard for these individuals to enter the education field nowadays. The education system looks like it's becoming an inner circle, basically, of a renowned elitist educators who have all the degrees, they have all the privileges, and they have the ability and the right to impose their viewpoints upon their students. And so because of this, and because there's some of these outlandish salaries that some of these highly educated elite educators get, whether it's through the colleges or through the high schools or whatever, in addition to the high cost that it takes for the everyday person to go through the college and graduate school system, it really looks to me like it's a racket, because and a racket in terms of it's meant to line the pockets of those who make it to that elitist inner circle of educators, and it's meant to just rip off other people while lining their pockets and giving them a pretty easy life, all things considered. So, I mean, and again, that's my opinion based on my own, experience in the education field. I've been working in the education field since I left college, and I see just all these barriers to these really, talented individuals who can educate. And it just seems that that's what it's become because these talented individuals are not able to get into the system, and the people who do get into the system seem more interested in their own lives and their own financial gains rather than in educating the students. Not in all cases, but I just see it more frequently than I would like to see. Paul, why don't we go to your position next? What position do you hold on our higher education system in America today?
You're attacking it from the supply side. What's the motivation of the colleges themselves? I'm going to attack it from a different side. I'm going to attack it from the demand side. What should one get out of college? What is one looking for when one goes to college? And so I guess I'm going to start. What is the purpose of higher education? And I'm going to say that there are four different purposes to higher education. The first is, well, at least in theory, the education itself. You want to learn something. You want to go to college. You're spending all that time in classes. In theory, you're going to learn something. So if obviously, the second thing is probably one of the most underrated things. It's networking. Very simply, you're looking to gain sort of a network where you can link up with other graduates, you can link up with with your peers, and you can have that network which you can rely on for getting jobs in the future and friendships in the future. Thirdly, certification. So you're saying, I have the mental capacity to get through a course of study. It may not be rigorous in, like, say, community college, or it may be less rigorous in say, community college. It might be more rigorous in the case of, say, Yale, but you're basically saying to the world, hey, I have the discipline to go through a course of study. And the fourth thing is you're looking for a college. Basically, a college has like a moral code or values. Now, it could be the moral code or values of a state school, which is basically Ohio State or Michigan or Florida, and you basically the sports team. Or you could be like fraternity, sorority, hey, it's a party school. Or you could basically be like an activism school, like, say, a Catholic school or like an Oberlin or whatever, where basically, but those are the four things you should be looking for out of higher education. And is it for everyone on the demand side? I would say no. So I think you have to go into higher education at least with an inkling of what you're going to do with it. And I don't know necessarily, I think the default tendency is to say, okay, kids, you're 17, 18, you go into higher education, and just because it's there, it's the thing to do. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to do because not everyone needs to do it. If you become a mechanic, for example, it's not something you necessarily need. So my point is that you try to know what you're doing with higher education before you actually call it a racket or not.
Okay, that's a very good premise, and I would say,
Mhm.
Matthew, what would be your position on higher education and what the role it has in America today?
I believe the role that it has is different from the role that it ought to be serving. I agree that there are multiple purposes behind it. I would say that there's a longer list of things that colleges accomplish today than they really ought. I believe that there are two main functions of a college education. The primary is one that there's requisite learning that has to have taken place for years prior, and it is to allow one to become an educated person. And I'm not saying that college makes anyone an educated person. I really don't believe that anyone can be truly educated until they're nearing the end of their life. I believe college is where you take the skills that have been taught, hopefully, prior to that, and learn to hone them much more than you previously could, and use all of the skills that you've managed to come together with and begin to take on all of the vast amounts of information that are there to be learned. Absolutely everything under the sun that there is to take into consideration. Secondly, is for professional accreditation. So I believe, Paul, you mentioned credentials. I think was the
Yes.
term. And I agree with that. I think and very important, one of the primary purposes behind college is to allow one to advance further towards a particular field of study in preparation of being able to excel in that particular field. But I really believe that two areas are really where colleges should be restricting themselves. Networking will naturally occur as a result of humans being around other humans. So I'm not disagreeing with that. I just think it's not a primary focus. I'll restrict myself to the primary. The first is preparing oneself to become an educated human being. If one completes college with whatever degree it happens to be, in engineering or statistics, whatever it is,
Mhm.
that alone doesn't demonstrate that you've received an education. That's demonstrated that you've put the necessary amount of work into learning in that particular field, and hopefully you're more likely to be able to apply the same habits that you've applied in that particular field towards becoming a wholly educated person for years to come. If you simply stop studying after you've graduated from college, then there's no chance you'll ever become an educated person. So if
Mhm.
the purpose of higher education is to educate the human person, with my understanding that you can't be educated by the time you reach that terminal degree, even if it is onto a PhD or double PhD, then it needs to be coupled with learning the skills necessary to, on your own, continue further study into adulthood.
Okay, another very, very good point. Very good premise. I mean, I know that personally, as I was listening to both of you, there are elements in what both of you said that I could very much agree with. And I know, I mean, on Paul's end, the side that I agree with very much is that, does everybody need to go to college? No, I would say not. Because, if somebody's going to learn how to fix cars for a living, I don't think you need a college degree for that. You certainly don't need a liberal arts degree, which seems to be what a lot of America's higher education institutions seem to be pushing people towards, either a liberal arts degree or something that's a spin-off of it, in some degree, or a rip-off of it. But yeah, I would agree with that premise that it's very much a something that should only be for the people who really truly need it, and things of that nature. On Matthew's end, it's I found myself agreeing with the premise that it's like the whole purpose of education is to be wholly formed, and to be wholly educated so that you can become a master in your field and so on. I would agree with that part. Where I would probably depart a little bit from the points you were making was that you and Paul both mentioned credentials and accreditation and things of that nature, and that is something that, as an educator myself, I have just found to. I find the process of becoming credentialed or accredited to have far more drawbacks than advantages. And the reason being is that is really rooted in human nature, because I've been around dozens and dozens of teachers. I've been around teachers who are really, really good at what they do. And I can say with 100% certainty from all this experience that I've had with all these different teachers that there is no two teachers who are alike. Every teacher has a particular element to their style which is uniquely theirs and which works very well, but it won't work with anybody else. Now, there may be parts that someone is able to copy and adapt to themselves, but you always find differences there. And because of that, and because of, it seems like in the credential and accreditation processes that we seem to have in America today, it seems that they're trying to push all educators into this one-size-fits-all mode of this is the only way that you're supposed to teach. You have to teach in, you have to accommodate all these different things, and you have to do them in a certain way, and you have to report that you've done them in a certain way in order to receive permission to form these young minds in the classroom. And again, my experience has told me that this mindset really doesn't work. In fact, it does more harm than good, because what it does is that it either malforms those who have good instincts for teaching into doing things that hamper or hinder their teaching method, or it leaves those people out completely and puts people into the field who maybe teaching is not something that they're supposed to do in the first place. And again, I'm going off experience here, but I know that I'm not the only one who thinks this, because there was an article that I read on a website for Foundation for Economic Education
Mhm.
by a teacher named Carrie McDonald. And she writes here, and the title of her article is really, really pointed. She says, licensing is preventing the best teachers from teaching. And she goes through and she lists a lot of these same problems that I just brought up. She actually gives an example of, a particular math teacher who she has, degrees in math. She's very good at that, but and she has decades of teaching experience, but she is not eligible to teach in most schools because she does not have the kind of education that state governments want to see her have, and that the federal government want to see her have, just because her education tends to be more in other fields. I think she doesn't really go into what level of graduate degree she has, but she says she has a graduate degree in mathematics, and that's pretty high praise. And I know that. If I were running a school, that would be someone who is like, yeah, I want to have that person teaching my math class. I don't care whether she has a class in diversive studies or something like that. I'm just trying to think of a class that I know of that teacher credential programs usually require teachers in training to take. So anyhow, so that's kind of where I'm coming from there, and I'd like to get your guys' input on that particular part. And just see, do you agree or disagree, or do you have a different approach to how you would take that, and so on? What would be your perspective? Matthew, why don't we go with you to start?
Interesting. I wasn't expecting the discussion to go towards the educators themselves. I suppose it's interesting in reflecting on it. If we talk about college preparing one for various professions, the vast majority of professions, when someone engages in it, something is produced. You are directly producing a product, service, something from that skill set. Historian, you're looking back at history, you're extrapolating information, and you're putting together some cogent analysis of what happened, why it happened, who was involved. If you're a mechanic, you fix whatever was broken, etc. Educators, though, as you're describing that, I'm realizing that there isn't a product that is directly produced by the educator. And the educator's role, from my understanding, is to engage the one to be educated in such a way that they can then use the tools that the educator's helping them to develop to become educated. Sorry, that just sounded odd to me, but that's as best as I
Made
I don't
sense
know
to
how
me.
else to say. So that's interesting. You're talking about a specific restriction on educators. I think that would be focusing upon the minority of professions, and this is without forethought, as much of my thoughts are. But I think the education profession is unique in itself because of how it works and what the goal is and the various ways that people are able to learn. You have the perhaps one of you knows the term. I believe they are kinetic learners.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yes, those learners.
they
So
learn by doing things.
yes, so we have
Maybe
the small
kinesthetic learners. I forget exactly what it's called, but I think
something that I'm
so.
sure we would all recognize if we saw it written down. Uh, I mean, they're in the vast minority, and very interestingly enough, they are in the majority in the prison system. So I would think it to be interesting to make note of that correlation and think that perhaps the way that we are educating people doesn't hit all persons the same way. Obviously, someone who can only learn by seeing things, if they're put in a school where there are no diagrams, they're not going to do very well. If our entire system is based upon having them sit in the chair and never move until recess, then these types of learners obviously are not going to do very well. So, coming back to educators being locked out effectively because a credential is being sought after rather than competency in job function, I think that's going to be the case across the board. And unfortunately, I think that speaks more to human nature than anything else. I mean, there's a reason that persons in marketing departments up at the top are so very highly paid. And it's because of their fundamental understanding of how humans work, how labeling works, and how persons are influenced by X, whatever it happens to be. So I think credentials are definitely part of it. The hope would be that in a higher education that's being provided in whatever field, that the amount of work that is being thrown at you to complete in order to reach that degree is sufficient for you to have all of the skills necessary to truly be proficient at that particular job. Now, education, that's one that I think is, again, very different from most other professions. I can say in my own, no one's going to learn how to do my job well unless you can do some math, unless you can do, items 1 through 7. There's some specific things, and you end up with a final product. And the degrees that relate to my field, they all do very much relate to the specific tasks that one needs to be able to do well in order to be proficient and really excellent in it. As far as education, I don't really know how that's done and how effectively they can measure those things that make you a good educator.
Yeah, and I mean, before I get to you, Paul, I just want to interject here to just try and clear the waters here, because
Mhm.
Matthew raises a good point. Is like, how do you evaluate, how well the educators are doing? In my own, because that is a very valid question, and that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of these regulations on teachers for basically, having to take all these classes in order to learn how to teach and stuff like that. Taking all these classes on, different, diverse styles and so on. And 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 the reality is, I mean, again, I'm speaking from my own experience here, is that I don't think that there is a proper way to determine what makes a good educator or not. At least there's not one that you can put in an administrative box, in a bureaucratic box. It's something that really can only be determined by the people who are receiving from the person who's educating. And again, that comes down to a case by case basis. That's not going to be a one size fits all basis. And again, this is a problem that really arises. Is, again, you can't put it in an administrative box. I know that the education hierarchy in this country have tried. They have tried since the 1970s to do this, to put basically to put educational standards in a box and to show, okay, this is how this is how we evaluate if the teachers are doing their jobs or not. And the simple fact of the matter is, because learners are so diverse, as you mentioned, Matthew, because there are many different kinds of learners, and sometimes you have people who have two different kinds of learning styles applied to different subjects, and so on. But what it really comes down to is that there is no proper way to evaluate, because every human being is just so unique, and they're going to learn in a very unique way. So, I mean, again, I'm speaking from my own experience here. So, again, Paul, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in front
Oh,
of you
no
there, but
worries.
I just wanted to make that clear that because Matthew raised that question, and I just felt that it was something to just clarify from my own experience and from the experiences that I've seen from talking with other teachers. So, so Paul, why don't we go in with you now and just get your insight on on teacher credentials and accreditation and all that, and where you would
So,
approach that.
so first of all, it doesn't seem like you have a problem with higher education per se. It seems like you have a problem with credentials. And it's sort of a case of where you sit is where you stand. And but what I mean by that is if you have a bad experience, you are going to interpret that in the light of your experience. Like if you have a bad experience in the light with credentialing, you are going to interpret it in the light. If you have trouble getting on the ground floor, so to speak, if you don't like network or whatever, you have difficulty getting certification or whatever because grades are low or whatever, and you have difficulty getting on the ground floor and you know you're a good teacher, of course you're going to be like, okay, this is ridiculous. Now, if you're already within the system, if you get the certification and get in on the ground floor, then it's great for you because it basically protects you. That's basically what tenure is. That's basically it's hard. It's often hard to hire or it's often hard to hire teachers and it's often hard to fire teachers because they're, I mean, they're sort of like in, especially my father was a public school teacher for 25 years, and there were teachers that he taught with that weren't necessarily interested in teaching or teaching effectively, but I mean, it was difficult to hire them or difficult to fire them just because they have their, what's the term, they're kind of locked into the system, so to speak. And so if you, I don't know if there's a way to, I don't know if there's a way to eliminate credentialism, though. I mean, it seems like how do you eliminate basically, there has to be some, does there have to be some standard, objective standard by which to evaluate teachers? And if you don't meet that standard, you're out. If you do meet that standard, I mean, but yeah, credentialism's a tricky thing.
Yeah, it is, and you raised some good questions, and I
Mhm.
mean, I mean, I probably should clarify one of the positions I take here is that I'm not opposed to teachers being receiving acquiring education. All right, that I have always understood that from the beginning. Like I know with me being a teacher,
Mhm.
I know that I would not be a good teacher. I would not be the kind of teacher that I am today if I had not received the college education that I did. And so I am perfectly willing to admit that education is needed. What my question becomes, and this is where I kind of start getting into the higher education is becoming a racket mentality,
Mhm.
is that the added requirements that they throw on top of getting a basic education, which enables you to teach.
Mhm.
Okay, because and that's kind of where my problem becomes, and because and I'm going to start tying this into kind of the bigger point that we had. We're going to kind of move out of the educators themselves and into the bigger system here
Mhm.
the because and again I'm speaking from my own experience and research here is that you have the basic subjects that you must show proficiency in order to get a degree that most teachers would be expected to have. And in this particular case, it would be a Bachelor of Arts. Almost any institution you will talk to, whether this institution abides by government certification standards or not, what they want to see is that you have a college degree. And it's
Mhm.
generally a bachelor's degree, which and again my attitude is that yes, you should be expecting something like that because this person has gone through the 4-year system and they have shown that they are proficient enough in the basic topics that are needed in order to graduate. Where the problem starts to come in is that now you have all these other classes that are being thrown on top, and these classes are more bureaucratic and administrative in nature. For example, like I mentioned, you have a number of diversity classes that are now required to be taken. And I'm not going to go off on a tangent here, on diversity, because that's a whole nother topic we could get into. And I'm not saying that we should put everybody in a one size fits all mentality here, because that's also wrong. But what I question is that whether diversity classes are needed, or whether it's just something that, because they say that nothing teaches as well as experience in many fields. And I've seen this myself as a teacher, in that I've learned to be more accommodating of people's diverse needs through actual practice than through anything that I've learned in a classroom. And so what it seems to me is that by throwing on these classes in diversity, throwing on these classes in classroom management, and I'm going to be frank with you here on the classes in classroom management. Classroom management makes or breaks a teacher. And it's
Mhm.
one of those things that if you don't have the ability to do it, no amount of training is going to give you that ability to do it. Because if a teacher is really good at what they do, classroom management almost comes naturally. You don't really need to practice it terribly much. You might have the problem student here or there, but you're not going to have a bunch of students who are not really interested, because if the teacher's good at what they do, the students are going to be paying attention to what the teacher's talking about, because the teacher is good at relating what's going on. And so when I look at these classroom management classes, I'm like, it's like you can't really teach that, because you either have it or you don't. And that kind of it's the same with almost any other profession. If you're going to be a mechanic, you either are mechanically inclined or you're not. Like I know for me, in my case, people have tried to train me how to fix cars or tractors, and I've been extremely bad at it. Even though how hard I've tried, I can't do it. I don't have a knack for it. Whereas in the classroom, I have a knack for keeping a class under control. I don't need the classroom management classes, because I already know how to do it, and because I'm already very on top of the subjects I teach. And so there's just a lot of that going on, where there seems to be there's a lot of this extraneous fluff that just gets thrown on top that you can't get certification without. And like I said, this is where it kind of ties into the racket, because my premise that there's a racket going on here, because it's not just education where they do this, or in preparing people for the education field where they do this. They've started doing this in other professions. I know in the healthcare business they've started doing it big time, because it used to be, it's like you had to take these basic classes, and you had to understand basic biology, and you had to keep learning even after you got your stamp of approval to become a doctor or something like that. It's like, but now they're adding it where you have to take all these other classes, which are worth another $100,000 or something like that. And there seems to be no real purpose to some of these other classes, because it's like, who really cares about what the practice is of mating squirrels or something like that. So I just made that one up here, but there's classes that ridiculous that are required in the healthcare field in order to obtain your doctorate now, and stuff like that. And
Well,
again, I'm
I
seeing
meant
it in other fields.
schools care.
So, but anyhow, so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on a huge rant there, but that's kind of what I want to get into the next bit here, is that it's like, where is the boundary that should be set? It's like how, and I know, Paul, you brought up the point of who determines that the educator's qualified or not. I mean, I have my own idea on that, but I'm going to hold off on that for the moment. And I'm just going to give you guys a chance to, either, add your own thoughts or maybe refute something or whatever. But Paul, why don't we go with you this time and just start off with, basically, where does the certification process go? When does it start becoming fluff, and all the money they're ripping off from people who are coming in to be educated starts becoming a problem?
Well, that's kind of the point of it. I mean, basically, it's to restrict the supply of teachers a little bit, or to, in other professions, you're trying to restrict the supply to make these professions more desirable, as it were. And so you're reducing the number, you're creating artificial barriers to entry. So that's I mean, you're saying this as though this is a bug rather than a feature. I mean, it's kind of the point to do this. I mean, obviously, if you're on the other side of it, if you're having difficulty getting over the barriers to entry, of course it stinks. Of course a lot of this stuff is relatively unnecessary. I'm sure some like classroom management might be useful for someone on the borderline who is maybe wants to be a teacher, maybe, and in some borderline cases it might help. But yeah, I largely agree that a lot of things that are administrative are unnecessary and really don't relate to teaching and don't necessarily make one a spectacular teacher. But again, I don't necessarily see certification as, I see it as basically saying, as a deliberate artificial barrier to entry. So I also see it to a certain degree as social, like basically the higher education administrators want to inculcate a certain worldview. And so if you're training in diversity courses or whatever, there's a certain worldview you wish taught from the classroom, or at least to have teachers to be exposed to that, so they're more willing to teach from that particular viewpoint. So there's both artificial barrier to entry and a desire to inculcate a different specific worldview. And I think that's deliberate in large part from the administrative. I think it's an attempt to standardize. From my perspective, or from your perspective, it might be an issue because maybe you want to go off in a different direction, but you want to be a rebel against the system, a counterculture, as it were. But I mean, there's always there's a reason for why the system's in place. It may not be a good one. It may be artificially enriching a certain class of people, but I mean, there's a reason why it's there, and so you can fight against it tooth and nail, or you can try and go along with the flow as best you can.
Yeah, you bring up something that actually I'm going to get back to as soon as I get Matthew's input here. But the facet that you brought up that I'd like to get back to is restricting the supply. And that's a question that I think, I mean, that goes beyond the teaching field. I think it goes into other fields as well. And I think that it's worthy debating, whether restricting the supply is a good thing or a bad thing. So, but again, we'll get back to that here in a moment. I'd like to get Matthew's perspective on what you and I have just said here, and just see, Matthew, what is your insight on what we were just talking about?
Insight. That's a big word. Two things. And I've just forgotten the first one. So I'll go into the second one. You had brought up the fact that you are doing away with niceness. You are inept in a particular field. And that calls to mind your initial point at the beginning, or perhaps it was Paul, actually, where college is not for everyone. Now, that is a loaded sentence, and many people have an emotional response when one says that, because most often that I've encountered, there is a perceived sense of elitism in that, where, well, college is a high and lofty thing for smart people, and that's not at all what I think it is. I think that the way that education was done not too long ago, that entailed apprenticeships, was a pretty clever way of doing things. There are certain professions that require, and I would say there's very many professions actually, that require very narrow skill sets that are finely honed, able to be proficient at them. And the subject of trade schools comes to mind whenever I discuss education holistically, from pre-kindergarten until death. Trade school is a valuable component of having a society on the professional credential side to ensure that people are going to be able to do the jobs that they're able to do. Now, if we were to bring back apprenticeships far more than these, I know we have internships where people learn the very valuable skills of how to make coffee the way that people like it, or file papers, make copies, etc. And there are some that are validly teaching people how to be a little bit better at it. But I think part of the problem is the the lack of focus on trade schools as a viable option, and the perception that a trade school is something that people go to when they're not smart enough for college. I think that is a huge problem, because if one is incredibly proficient in a particular field and trade school covers all that you need to do in order to be able to move forward in it and have that credential and not be bogged down with unnecessary classes that may or very likely may not have anything whatsoever to do with your job performance in that field. Well, I mean, it's pretty cut and dry when I think of it. And I still don't remember what the first point was, so I'm going to stick with trade schools. And that was basically basically it. Just wanted to bring it into the conversation because it is important. And there's the first point. I think part of the problem is that there are so many opinions about the end of college, the purpose of education itself is underlying all of this discussion. And I think there's even, as we learned in the first 3 minutes, there's some disagreement just among the three of us as to the purpose of higher education. So I think until societally we can agree upon the primary purposes of education, we can't begin to discuss the inadequacies or advantages of the systems in place, because, you know, to person A, well, the system is designed to get you to red. Person B, the system is designed to get you to blue. So of course there's going to be disagreements because there's different goals in mind. And I think we really need to have a serious discussion about the value placed upon education and what it exactly is supposed to be able to do for someone after the end of paying their X amount of dollars for it and spending X amount of time, what they should end up with, what skill sets they should have, what accreditations, etc.
Matthew, you bring up the the attitude, the practice of trade schools, and this attitude that college is somehow better than trade schools and so on. And you kind of hit home for me there, because it's like, I think that you are correct in saying that trade schools shouldn't be stigmatized, and I think by that same token, colleges should not be so lauded. They definitely should not be, they should not be looked upon as being better than trade schools in any way. I mean, college for some reason has this very vaunted status to it, and it's, in its defense, I will say that that comes from centuries of admittance to colleges being very restricted, and stuff like that. You didn't go to college unless you were incredibly brilliant, like Thomas Aquinas, or unless you had a lot of people paying your way through, like a lot of the monarchs, back before we got into the democracy experiment in the 19th century. And so you have this situation here where college is looked upon, and higher education in general is just looked upon as a very vaunted status, and that still exists today despite this push to make college available for everybody. But I think what we need to get back to here is that, and I think this is something that society needs to do, is to just get back to this attitude that or to adopt this attitude that college is great, but it does not have a status. It's not above trade school. Okay, it's on trade schools on the same plane as it. Going a direct apprenticeship into another field is on the same plane as going to college or going to a trade school or something like that. It's like maybe as a society that's something that we should do. Is basically change this attitude so that basically there won't be a stigma that comes from going to a trade school or something like that. and I want to tie that into the other point that I wanted to bring up here, which is restricting the supply. And just personally, that phrase, restricting the supply, it kind of grinds in my craw, because when I'm looking at the world in general, it's just like, I mean, we're all Catholics here, but in Catholic theology, they always speak about an abundance. They always speak about that there should be an abundance, and so on, and that we should be willing to share that abundance. And so whenever somebody talks about restricting supply, it's just like, it's like that shouldn't be the case. It's like we shouldn't really be looking to restrict the supply. That's not man's role. Man's role should be looking to better the lot of his fellow man in many ways, and serving God, of course. But when you restrict the supply, you inhibit man's ability to better the life of his fellow man. And it's like, and I know some people might throw the argument out here that it's like that, well, if you don't restrict the supply, then you got people who don't have a clue as to what they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing, like practicing medicine. I know this is an argument I keep hearing all the time. It's like, well, if you don't put these restrictions on doctors, if you don't put these restrictions on the doctor's field, you're going to have a bunch of quacks running around with all these remedies that do more harm than good. And I mean, and I guess the distinction that I just want to throw in here is that I'm not saying that people shouldn't be educated in their field, and that if people are not qualified to do this, that they shouldn't be kept out of that field. My point is that it's like you shouldn't make it so hard that people who naturally or that people who can make it but maybe are prevented from doing so because of this effort to restrict the supply, that you shouldn't have that going on. That you should open it to everyone who would be willing to try it, but then it's left up to the individual people who train these people to go further on in the field to tell them, it's like, I don't really think that this is your field, you should try something else, or something like that. Because that's the whole point of parents and mentors. I mean, parents and mentors and teachers are meant to direct the people who are in the formation stages of their life to go to where their talents can be best used. And that's not a disparagement on these people. It's just helping on these young people who are being formed. It's just helping them to recognize where their true strengths are. Because, I mean, my view, and this kind of ties into something of my view of the world, is that if people were allowed to use their strengths more, I don't think we would have as many societal problems as we see in the world today. And again, that's my premise coming from just experiences I've had. But anyhow, that went a little long. But Matthew, do you want to add into that? Kind of tie into that there. The restricting the supply and the other point that I raised.
I'm going to say no, solely for the reason that I'd like to hear Paul's take.
Okay. I'm going to throw a curveball here. I don't necessarily have a problem with restricting the supply for a couple of reasons. One, because, simple supply and demand is basically, if you reduce the supply, that means that you're going to pay those who are already in the profession more. So teachers already are notoriously not well paid. So let's say you have like an extra 100,000 potential teachers, that further lowers the supply, that further lowers the wages. So there's a little bit more going on to that. It's sort of, in a way, it's a protection of those already within the system itself. This is a common thing, basically, within other professions as well. Unions tend to like higher minimum wages. Well, why is that? Because they're trying to protect their own wages as well. And so you guys are both much more idealistic than I am, I suspect. And it basically came out right in the beginning that basically you're looking at it, well, from in an ideal world, I mean, the purpose of education, at least from an administrator's perspective, is to teach children, basically help students become the best that they can be. But unfortunately, we don't live in purely an ideal world. administrators are going to want to make sure that their teachers are happy and can stay. So that if that means basically restricting the supply so that the teachers they currently have, they can pay enough to those teachers to make them stay. That's they're going to do that. If they want to inculcate a certain worldview, they're going to try and do that. If they want to be highly paid and make enough money to support themselves, I mean, basically that through the education industry, they're going to do that. So I think, yes, ideally, the purpose of education is to make students be the best they can be, to help them along this lifelong process of learning. I think it does, idealism and practical reality often rub up against one another, though. So
I would, yeah, I understand your point that it's like idealism and reality do rub up against each other quite frequently, and there's often conflict between the two. So I mean, we've seen that throughout the history of the world. But before we get to Matthew's point, Paul, I just want to. I want to get your idea on the point I raised a little bit earlier about bringing college down from its vaunted place, of being the ultimate end all and and stuff like that, down to the same level of the trade schools and internships, and doing that as a society. Is that a premise that you would agree with? In many
again,
ways, or not?
believe it or not, I would disagree with that premise as well. I think that college should have a high. I think that those who engage in the pursuits of the mind actively should be rewarded for that. I don't think trade schools should have a stigma against them, because no, what they're doing is worthy work as well. But I mean, I don't necessarily think trashing one institution at the expense of the other, or trying to level the playing field, as it were. I think there's a tendency to, okay, let's knock college off its perch. And no, you don't want to do that. You want to put everything on the level that it should be. And I think that the pursuits of the mind are good things, and they should be definitely encouraged. And they do lead to well-paying jobs, oftentimes, in large part because they do provide some people, not everyone, but some people with those, what's the term? The skills they need to do well, whether like engineering school and engineering, or like that's kind of a trade school itself, but that's a little bit. But like Yale or Harvard or whatever, you do have these people that go into government, and they should. I mean, I don't necessarily think it's necessarily a bad thing that they go into government or business or whatever. So, yeah, I actually don't. I don't like the idea of knocking Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, or robbing college of its dignity so as to artificially lift trade schools up. I think they both have their purpose, and they both should be encouraged. So,
No, there's something to be said that it's like that. There's certain elements of education that stimulates the mind over the education that works through the hands. There certainly are differences, and because we are all spiritual beings, that is the education of the mind obviously has to have its place in many ways. So I think those are valid points. I don't know if I necessarily agree with all of what you said there, but I I think you raised some very valid points. So
yes, we
um,
haven't heard you. We have a place where we disagree. This did not happen last time.
no, it didn't.
If I can,
Matthew, why
if
don't
I
we
can,
get into you now? Just a reminder here: we were talking about restricting the supply of teachers or doctors or whatever, and college being on the same playing field as trade schools and internships and so on.
I think the system needs to be open enough to competition, provided that we have an adequate way to determine of those who are competing who actually possess the requisite skill sets to be able to perform whatever function it is, whether it be education or any other any other profession. With respect to this trade school discussion, I don't fully recall what I may have intimated when I spoke about it the first time. I was not seeking to lower college in any way. I believe that we can most certainly, and I thought it was funny, Paul, you threw the idealist label on me. I'll throw it right back at you.
Mhm.
For note that there is a difference. The object of college is, objectively speaking, a more noble object than the object of the trade schools, simply
Okay.
because, as excuse me, as Grant alluded to, we are both corporeal and spiritual beings. The spiritual is ranked more highly than the physical. For those, so those things that are more purely physical are, by necessity, considered to be less noble, and it is much more restrictive. So I don't want to press the idealism of it much at all. It's simply different strokes for different folks. Some persons are inclined, predisposed to fulfill certain functions.
Yeah.
If you
And,
can discern, oh, go ahead, Paul. You had
and
something?
that I definitely agree with. I agree with that 100%. But keep going.
And okay, well, see, it's 2-on-1. You want to disagree, Grant, or you want to hop on board?
Um,
Join the awesome train.
I would rather I would rather hold my judgment until I hear the remainder of your train of thought there, Matthew.
Well, we're coming up to the caboose soon. That's effectively it. With respect to the trade school and college discussion, the big piece missing from this, due to time constraints, is the discussion of what needs to have occurred prior to college, because there's a certain assumption that we all have of what someone has learned up until this point. And I really believe that much of what is taught in colleges today should have been taught in the high school levels. And I'm actually more inclined to say that a lot of the professional training that occurs in colleges should be relegated to different trade schools, and colleges should be more focused upon, as Grant, you mentioned at the beginning, a liberal arts degree. I believe that colleges should be more focused upon providing a liberal education, educating the whole human person, more specifically along particular career paths where trade school isn't more appropriate, but it should be about educating the whole human person, and we should not be waiting until college to start teaching it. It seems as though many of the earlier years, many people think that rote memorization is the way to go rather than learning what you need to ask the questions, find the answers, develop your thoughts, uh, have arguments, not fights, true arguments, Aristotelian logic arguments. A lot of this stuff is lacking, and because of that, it makes the discussion about higher education, many of the discussions that I have about it are, and I don't allude to this conversation, and I don't mean it as a slight at all, pointless, because you need to focus on step 1 before you can focus on step 7, because it's going to determine the foundation upon which 7 rests. So that's it from me.
Yeah, and I can I agree with you on that premise, Matthew, that a lot of what they teach in colleges should be taught at the high school level, because I know for a fact. I do not remember where I read this, but I read it a few days ago. Somebody came across an old test from the 1910s, 20s, or 30s. I forget which. I think it was 1930s, and they compared it with a test that high schoolers are taking today. And this was a high school test from the 1930s, and the questions that were on that high school test from the 1930s are the kind of questions that you find in a senior level college class today. which I don't know. I came out of reading that article and I was rather disturbed that this was how far our education system has fallen. In that, basically, we're not giving the students the opportunities that we're not giving the students the proper formation in the high school level that they need to have. And so I would agree with that premise in that a lot of the education that we see at the college level today should be brought back down to the high school level, and that's I know a lot of people have said it's like, well, school was a lot more rigorous back then, in educational standards, and I'm like, it's like maybe that was what was needed back then, rather than evaluating people just by how good of a test test taker they are. It's like maybe they should be evaluated on how well they think creatively. And I know this is this is a great travesty that I find in so many high schools today. I think I've only seen a few high schools, and and from my memory too, they were all private high schools. But I've come across several high schools where they do not teach Aristotelian logic. They do not teach logic in any way, shape, or form. And like I said, I only see that logic being taught really in private high schools, and even then, it's not terribly many. And I don't know about you gentlemen, but I know in my own education experience, when I was learning, my learning ability really did not take off until after I had taken logic, until after I had mastered logic. Then I was able to think, I was able to discern, I was able to make cohesive arguments. Before then, all I could do was summarize. And it seems like in our education system today that's all that's required of students is to summarize. So I think, and so I mean, I didn't mean to go off on too much of a tangent there, but like I said, Matthew kind of raises a very excellent point in that is like the kind of education we're talking about here, is like the education which forms the human mind and so on. That is more spiritual in nature and so on, or it has more of a spiritual background. It should be done at the high school level, not at the college level. The college level should be reserved for those who want to take it further. And I think that that's probably where maybe this societal disconnect about college is coming into play now, is that we have colleges looked upon as necessary because high school's not doing what it was originally supposed to do. So my mind's slipping a little bit here. I know, Paul, you wanted to see if I agreed with you guys on a particular point. Would you mind refreshing my memory on what that point was?
I'm not actually sure at this point. I think, yeah, I was actually really glad when it came to the point about basically college learning being taught at earlier ages. Because I had a whole set of notes, and it's funny because the talk went in a completely different, our discussion went in a different direction than I thought it was going to go. But the whole point about basically college, like things being taught at an older age than they are like now than they were like say 30 years ago, was literally the last point on my list. And so I was really, really glad to hear Matthew bring that up. And that was actually how I wanted to end the discussion.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Because as noted before, we were all looking at this. Most of the discussion's been sort of from the supply side. What should administrators do? What should teachers do to basically kind of break the lock, as it were, of credentialism? And I think what you and I and most like those and people with families should do is to encourage excellence at an earlier age among one's own children, one's own students, to basically push people into excellence, as it were, to encourage students to basically know what you are getting into with college. to be able to make informed decisions earlier. And I think that is the way forward as to improving college, to basically make people, or to encourage people to become, what's the term, more well-rounded earlier in their lives. Partially, I mean, for its own sake, because being well-rounded is better long-term for one, but also as a way of assisting in the purpose of knowing what you're doing will help. Like, if you know, okay, I'm going to become like an engineer or something, so I'm going to take largely an engineer track. And obviously, this is not going to happen all the time, because you might decide, okay, I like engineering, and then you take it for a year, being like, oh, I don't want to do that. I want to I find a different passion instead. But you've at least tried something. So what you do is you encourage students, okay, find what you're good at, and aim in that direction. If it does work out, great. If it doesn't work out, then you've at least tried something. But you do that at as early age as possible, as parents, as teachers, to encourage excellence in both in a particular field for students, because obviously all students are different, and excellence in general, to be the best people they can be. And I think that is how you improve education in the long term, in a culture of excellence. And that,
Yeah.
I am done there.
Okay, that's very. I think again, very very valid points raised and very good points. Matthew, why don't we get your perspective on that end?
I say poppycock to everything that Paul just said.
Oh, nice. Good for you.
Of course, we had
Tell
to
me
have some
more. Do
fireworks
tell
there.
me more.
No, I don't. I don't disagree. I don't think I have a tremendous amount to add. As Paul was talking, um, a finger point came to my mind, and it's really blaming John Dewey a little bit for the state of our education.
Matthew, you're a
Touche.
good man. You're a very good man.
Because that's what I mean, the undercurrent of our, and I say our to mean just societally, our thoughts on education have been largely influenced, I believe, by John Dewey's philosophy. And Paul, you're talking about something that's very well. He would have disagreed with you, so I happen to agree with you. Uh,
Yay.
yes, we do need to focus upon the higher things. I mean, teaching children in these formative years, there's a reason we call them formative years. It's when they're most receptive. It's when their minds are most pliable. This is when they need to be stretched and expanded and given direction. And it's not a singular direction, as Paul was talking about, where you select one thing you might like and you run as fast as you can. No, it's teaching them how to be a human person, learning how to evaluate thoughts, learning how to think, how to be able to utilize logic properly. And these very basic things aren't being done until much later in life,
If at
when,
all.
yeah, if at all, exactly, if at all. I mean, otherwise, most Aristotelian logic isn't even taught. I believe mostly symbolic logic is taught, which sounds neat and tidy, and on paper it makes great sense until you realize that you can have syllogisms with conclusions that are completely ridiculous, not based in reality, but they are valid by the rules of symbolic logic, as opposed to Aristotelian, where it's commonsensical, it's useful, it makes sense, it's rational, it's not as pretty on paper, but for the purpose of being a human person, wanting to hold discourse with another human person or reach a conclusion of any kind that might be valid, then it's demonstrated itself to be superior. So, and that's just logic. But I do think that doing much more earlier on for children is essential. And it does start with parents being able to place that importance upon it. And eliminating the utilitarian perspective on education, where the purpose of an education is to get a good paying job so that you can have a very expensive casket. And that's just ridiculous. It's not about leading a good life or a fulfilling life. We all want to be happy. I don't think anyone can reasonably argue that we do everything because we think it's going to make us happy. We're always aiming for happiness. And we know that we're happy when we're more fulfilled. And if we're given however many gifts we are given and we use them, and education is the primary means by which we learn how to use the gifts that we have a far greater chance of leading a fulfilling existence and therefore a happy existence than if we simply learn how to design a widget so that we can make tons of money making that greatest widget in the world. That's all.
Okay, and that, yeah, and I think I already made my point before Paul's there, so I'm not going to add anything to that except to say that there were many elements that you both raised that are that I agree with very, very much, and I think we could probably agree on this premise that that basically the root of the problem in higher education today could probably be traced back to the fact that high school education is not equipping children in the formative years like it should. I mean, is that probably a premise that we could all agree on from this discussion?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, not for everyone per se, but I think that's in general a fair characterization.
I think that is one of the foundational elements, but of course it goes back to what happens prior to high school and the general mindset of people about the word education. If I would be very interested in polling 1,000 people off of the streets throughout various economic strata, etc. What is education? What is it for? I would be very interested in knowing what those answers are, because the disparity in those answers, I believe that's where the problem lies. Because until we can agree upon purpose for it, again, we can't move forward because we're trying to go in different directions.
Yeah, that's yeah, I would agree with that too. I mean, I think that the concept of education and what it is it's been twisted in many ways, and it's very much it means something very different to a lot of different people. So, in closing here, I would just like to get just some closing thoughts from each of you, and then I'll give my own on the what we as individuals can do right now, you know, to address some of these problems. I mean, like I know, I mean, two of us here obviously are not married, but it's like, but what can we as individuals do? You know, if somebody were to come up to us and say, what can I do, to try and do a small thing in my own way to try and fix some of these things that have gone wrong and so on. Paul, why don't we start on your end? I mean, what do you think are some just basic, very basic, simple things that people can do to kind of address some of this?
Part of that depends on what profession you're in. Obviously, if you in particular are in the educational field, you have more of the, what's the term, ability to interact with kids than I do, because I work in both writing and fundraising, both of which are a little bit less kid-friendly fields, so to speak. But what I can do is basically be the best person you can be. Encourage excellence in your own life. That virtue is an attractive thing in that it gets you set. Once you are set fire, other people are set fire as well, basically. And so you encourage excellence in your own life, and people ask, okay, what makes this person good at what he does or good at what she does? And you, by example, and in conversation, if it is brought up, obviously, you try. you encourage excellence. And it's a little bit harder when you're in a, so to speak, a bubble where there aren't a lot of kids, because obviously you can't encourage that among children. For you, Grant, because you work around children, you have, that is in a large part your vocation, to set fire to minds, as it were, to help. And obviously you don't have full control over that, but you can do it in part. And Matthew, as you are married, obviously, I obviously, if and when you have children, um, you will have that in a very personal level with your own children as well. And I don't know how kid-friendly the business field is. I suspect it's probably about the same as my field, which is to say not very much. But in terms of how often you get to interact with children. But I think, again, that pursuit of excellence in your own life and the willingness to push it among others is key. So I think I'll stop there and leave the last word to either Matthew or Grant.
Okay, Matthew, why don't we get? Would you like to go next, or would you like to hear what I have to say next?
I'll go ahead. You can correct me.
Okay. Okay.
I think I liked Paul's plagiarism of the U.S. Army there. I mean, be all that you can be. Do all that you are given to do, and do it to the best of your ability. And that is something that is attractive to people when they see someone living out their potential. It is encouraging to most. And I think that is an excellent place to start, because start within yourself for any change that you wish to see. Also, in all other discussions that you have with people, allow it to come up. I mean, as we're interacting with other human persons, if we really keep in mind that we are here to serve others, we are genuinely interested in the lives of others, and if we truly believe that we know something that they need to know, and that knowing it will increase the likelihood that they'll be able to be happy because they'll be perhaps more inclined to practice it, then we're going to feel inclined to mention it, even if it doesn't come up naturally in conversation. Hey, what have you read lately? Talk a little bit about various areas rather than simply with my workmates, we speak a fair amount about work, numbers, financial planning, etc. Very exciting things to accountants and financial advisors. But a great deal of our discussion invariably goes to everything else under the sun, because everybody's a person first before anything else. And education is about the formation of the person. So I agree, Paul, it's going to be a very interesting time once I have my own little person to directly
Yeah.
But I think that is what we can do. All we can do is be who we're supposed to be and have some fortitude in those discussions with people, even when we know that they're going to disagree with us. Great. Let them disagree. Hash it out. Use some logic to determine whose view is superior or correct.
Okay, you both raise very good practical approaches there, and I do agree, and I'm actually going to be here. I'm going to agree with you guys, but I'm going to build on it, just like I'm trying to build a tower on top of the house that you guys built. So, and
Jenga.
and what I'm going to wrap up here with a practical application is that yes, we should be all that we can be, but I think the number one thing, and I'm not speaking this as an educator, I'm speaking this just as a person in general. when we get to a certain age, because I think I forget who brought it up in the beginning. It might have been Paul, who said that we do not cease learning until we die, and
That
we
was
are not.
definitely Matthew. I just want that pointed out.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so, but I want to build off that point in saying that the first thing that we can do practically, and I'm not disparaging the education that we've already received in any way, um, but it is our responsibility to continue to educate ourselves, and I think that that's the number one thing that we should do in this particular field to try and improve things, because whether we realize it or not, and I mean, maybe this just comes naturally to me because I'm an educator and I see it more frequently. But in our interactions with people every day, we have opportunities to educate that come up, I don't know, at least hundreds of times a day. And where we have the ability to educate someone else off something that we know or something that we've learned or so on. And but in order to share that education that we have, we need to continue enhancing our education of ourselves. And so therefore it is our responsibility to continue to educate ourselves, to find books to read on topics that we should know more about. um, I mean, this kind of ties in a little bit to something I mentioned earlier with the spiritual life. Is like in order to enhance a spiritual life, you need to do a lot of spiritual reading. And I think anyone in any religion would agree with that. Um, but in the education field, I think that that's a very practical thing that we have to do as individuals, is we need to continue to educate ourselves, fill in the gaps where maybe we didn't take advantage of an opportunity when we were younger to fill in that particular gap, and so on. And thereby, and then share this knowledge that we have, therefore helping more well-round the people around us who may have had gaps in their own learning experiences, and so on. Um, I know that one of the ways that I try to enhance education of others, especially of children, is through my example. I try to give them an example of someone who is studying constantly. I try to give them an example of someone who, is like, if I don't know something, I'm frank with them and I say, I don't know, but I will get back to you on that, once I learn more about it, and so on. And I always encourage them to learn more about this particular topic or that particular topic. And I think that's another thing that we could do in our interactions with others, is to just urge them, if they don't know very much about this particular topic, point them to resources, point them to things that they can read and learn more about this topic, and just more well-round their experience as a result. As far as the system goes, um, it's going to take a lot of reform, and it's a very long and complicated process. We did not get to this point overnight. If I remember right, I think Mr. Dewey has been in the grave for a number of years now. His
Quite a few.
movement, yeah, and so his movement did not happen overnight. He is long gone, but the effects of his movement remain with us. It's going to take, I would say, a number of decades before we pull ourselves out of what he has left us with. So, and but I think that that's the main premise that I would like to leave with here, is that it's like, be all that you can be, but I think that one of the primary things that you should try to be all that you can be with is to continue studying yourself and to encourage others to study themselves, no matter what age that they are. So, well, thank you both for coming on board with me here this evening. It was quite entertaining discussing this topic with you, even though I know we did not come to a agreement on all of the topics discussed, but that actually makes it more juicy in many ways, I would think.
You mean we have different brains? That's weird.
Excellent point. So, but I'll definitely have to have you two back on again here really soon. It's always intellectually stimulating whenever we have one of these discussions. It makes us think of a lot of things that we would not normally think of, I think, in the larger world, especially when we go through our day-to-day activities. But thank you both for being on with me here this evening.
Thank you for having us. Matthew, Grant, thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode of the Rural Sense Show, and be sure to tune in next time when we will have another great conversation on the issues of the day. Remember, the solutions to today's problems always begin with you in your community. Take care, everyone. So long.